Welcome to this explainer. As a historian looking back at the ancient world, it's so easy to just get completely lost in the grand narratives, right? The sweeping battles, the towering marble architecture, the legendary emperors. But today, we're doing something different. We are going to examine the year 67 AD, not as some ancient myth, but as a clinical case study in the absolute horrors of unchecked imperial overreach. We're going to pull back the curtain and unravel exactly how a system rots from the inside out. Okay, picture this. Rome, 67 AD. The marble streets are absolutely packed with a crowd pressing forward to see a grand wedding procession. But the crowd is dead quiet. And I don't mean a respectful quiet. It's a terrified, suffocating quiet. They're watching this beautiful young bride pass by in full imperial robes, but they all know the horrifying truth. That bride, it's actually a captive boy named Sporus, who was physically altered on imperial orders and basically handed over to the most powerful man alive as a piece of property. So what does systemic abuse actually mean in this context? Well, to really understand Sporos's fate, we have to look through the lens of history at what happens when absolute power is handed to a deeply broken man, and worse, supported by a system that is just too cowardly to stop him. Sporos was dragged from the dirt of the market right onto the marble floors of the palace. He had zero say in the matter, no choice. This wasn't just one man acting cruelly. This was systemic abuse functioning exactly the way it was designed to. Let's move to part 1, a wedding built on cruelty. So the whole catalyst for this absolute nightmare was Emperor Nero's sheer obsession with his second wife, Poppaea Sabina. She was brilliant, she was ambitious, but in 65 AD, she died while pregnant. Now, the official imperial record, it cited childbirth complications, but the rumor circulating at literally every dinner table in Rome was that Nero came home drunk from chariot racing and kicked her, causing her death. Afterward, Nero wept publicly, forced the Senate to declare her a goddess, and even kept her hair by his bedside. He was completely shattered. But instead of just mourning, he took that terrifying, unhinged grief and weaponized it against a powerless boy simply because Sporus happened to resemble her. I mean, think about it. Nero was only 27 years old and he had already murdered his own mother and executed his first wife. He was deeply, deeply broken. But here's the crucial thing. The monster wasn't just Nero's grief. The real monster was the limitless imperial machinery that allowed him to act on that madness without facing a single consequence. Which brings us to part 2, Anatomy of Absolute Power. It is truly chilling to read how Roman historians recorded the cold, mechanical efficiency of this atrocity. First, the imperial order is given. Then, the brutal procedure itself. Palace physicians perform a deadly surgery on this boy. And remember, in ancient Rome, there's no anesthesia, right? There's just wine. You were held down on a table while the state forcibly altered your body. Finally, the boy is dressed up in the dead empress's actual robes, her jewels, her cosmetics. He was literally reworked, feature by feature, until he became a convincing living ghost of a dead woman. As a historian trying to dig up the actual human reality behind these ancient texts, it just breaks your heart to realize that Sporus's only escape was his private memories. He probably remembered hanging out in the market with his friends, stealing loaves of bread, the dust kicking up around his sandals, the scrape of the stone streets. But man, nostalgia is a luxury you just cannot afford when your present reality is chained to a tyrant who is actively burning down the empire. Now, zooming out a bit, let's look at part 3, a bankrupt, bleeding empire. Okay, the sheer cowardice of the Roman elite here is staggering. Seriously, every time Nero introduced Sporus as his wife, governors and massive, powerful senators would literally pause for a half second, physically adjust their faces, and then bow. They publicly validated Nero's madness every single day. Meanwhile, they kept their true opinions locked away in windowless rooms, only feeling brave enough to write about how insane it all was after Nero was safely dead. That complicity right there, that is the absolute bedrock of tyranny. And while these elites are busy bowing to a ghost, the empire itself is quietly bleeding out. Nero raised taxes on a population that was already starving. When that wasn't enough cash, he devalued the silver content of the denarius so he could just print more coins with less actual value. He was literally harvesting his own people to fund his vanity, triggering this devastating state-sponsored inflation, all while completely ignoring the late grain shipments that fed the city.
So what's the sensible thing for an emperor to do in a crisis like this? Stay in Rome, balance the budget, manage the food shortage, right? Instead, Nero packs up 5,000, yes, 5,000 bodyguards, all his musicians, his entire wardrobe, and his captive boy bride, and totally abandons Rome for a massive year-long luxury vacation in Greece to pursue his acting career. You literally cannot make this up.
And the systemic rot really hits its peak in Greece. Nero ordered all 4 sacred Panhellenic Games to be held in the exact same year just for him. He forced the terrified public to sit and cheer as he gave these pathetic, raspy theater performances, insisting on playing pregnant women or chained slaves. And get this, because he made it a capital offense to leave the theater while he was on stage, women actually faked going into labor just to get carried out without being executed. He even entered an Olympic chariot race, was violently thrown from his chariot into the dirt, didn't even finish the race, and the terrified judges still marched right up and declared him the gold medalist. Which leads us to part 4, the fall of the tyrant. You know, it's wild how an empire that takes centuries to build can just unravel in a matter of weeks. By early 68 AD, the delusion finally shattered. Battle-hardened legions from the western provinces finally had enough and marched on Rome. And how did the mighty imperial system react? It just evaporated. There was no grand, epic confrontation. Nero's entire inner circle simply stopped showing up to work. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The very system he built completely vanished overnight, leaving Nero waking up terrified, running barefoot through the dark halls of the palace, shouting into the emptiness, "Have I neither friend nor foe?" Out of an empire of literally millions of people, only 4 agreed to flee with him. And of course, Sporus was forced to be one of them. They rode out in the dead of night to this miserable little dirt villa. As the Senate's cavalry arrived outside, the hyperventilating emperor couldn't even do it himself. He had to force his terrified secretary's hand to help guide the fatal blade. Nero collapses into the mud, whispering, "What an artist dies in me," leaving behind a totally ruined state.
Now, you might be thinking, great, Nero's dead, the nightmare's over for Sporus, right? Wrong. When the monster dies, the system doesn't rescue his toys. They're just passed to the next tyrant in line. First, an ambitious general claims Sporus as a prize of war. Barely a month later, Emperor Otho takes the throne and claims him. And this is pure psychological horror, because Otho was Poppaea's actual first husband before Nero stole her. He trapped Sporus in this psychotic loop of playing a dead woman for the man who actually loved her first. Then, just 3 months after that, Emperor Vitellius seizes power, a man who absolutely despises Nero and wants to erase his legacy from the face of the earth. This brings us to our final and honestly darkest lesson. Part 5, History Erases the Powerless. Emperor Vitellius decrees that to celebrate his shiny new victory, Sporus is going to be thrown into a massive gladiatorial game. He was scheduled to be executed for the entertainment of 50,000 people. I really want you to think about that number for a second. That is the exact same crowd, the same 50,000 people that had been bowing to him in the streets just 1 year prior. Sitting there in the dark, listening to that crowd chanting for blood, Sporus finally realized that no rescue was coming, not from a society that viewed him as just an imperial prop rather than a human being. Refusing to let them turn his death into cheap theater, Sporus reclaimed his autonomy in the only tragic way he had left. He ended his own life in the darkness of that cell before the guards could even drag him out to the arena. So, as we wrap up this historical analysis, we're left with a really vital task: critically examining our primary sources. Why did the Roman historians, who, let's remember, were the very senators who stood by and allowed this to happen, write about Sporus as merely a freakish footnote, a fake empress, a bizarre punchline? They did it on purpose. They did it to avoid painting him as a genuine victim of their own cowardly complicity. Because honestly, if we don't look past these self-serving narratives written by the people holding all the power, then the systemic abuse wins, period. The historians didn't write about the boy stealing bread in the market. They wrote about a monster's toy. And I think that leaves us with a pretty chilling question to ask about our own world today. When we read the grand, sweeping narratives of history, whose erased voices are we completely failing to hear?